And we are live, officially discussing the Ukraine situation again, of course. Western autism at work. And so I am joined by an excellent guest, Raging Mandrill. How are you doing today? So I am joined
Hold on,
by
let me.
an excellent guest, Raging Mandrill. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Glad to be back. Although I'm not so glad about the subject material.
Yeah, the subject material is kind of concerning, especially as a lot of innocent people could die in the crossfire because
Sorry,
of
my
global interest.
audio is a little crazy here. I'm
Um,
getting like double feedback. One sec. Okay, we should be good now.
Okay, is it working now?
Yeah, it's fine now.
Okay, sorry about the audio issue. So, if you guys don't know, the most recent escalation in the Donbass region began a couple days ago, actually, when images were circulating of a gas pipeline or gas station in Luhansk or Donetsk exploding, and many people theorizing how this could be used as a pretext for escalation or invasion by either Russia or the Ukrainians. And so that was interesting, but then that kind of faded away. And the line of contact experienced a lot of artillery fire from both sides and the region. So that escalation prompted many to say that this was going to be an imminent invasion. And then there were plans found by these separatist leaders that said Ukraine was going to invade them. I'm not sure how legitimate those plans were. Ukraine denied those plans. And then, most recently, catching up to date with the situation, Russia officially recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as separate republics from Ukraine, of course. The situation has been de facto since 2014. However, the official recognition means that they can be more open with sending troops in. And so they already have officially. Last night we saw troops moving in with the Russian flag. We saw separate celebrations in Donetsk city and Luhansk celebrating Russia's official blessing, and troops officially moving in to supplicate the separatist leaders and their troops. And so that is the current situation.
Right, and it's important to remember that that the separatist-backed governments did ask for official recognition here, which Russia did give, and I think Putin also went to the Duma this morning, or I think either this morning or last night. It was reported this morning. He basically went. I shouldn't say the Duma. He that's the old term, but he basically went to the Russian Federation's their version of parliament, basically, and asked them for the ability to deploy Russian troops not on Russian soil. So, and of course, they obviously granted that, which has naturally followed that the Western powers have begun sanctions. The UK, at least, has imposed sanctions on 5 Russian banks and 3 individual Russians. So obviously, that's the Russian oligarch class there. Um, uh, this is a significant escalation, right? We've also seen recently, like I've mentioned before, the diplomatic situation is also starting to break down a lot. You have seen last week and in previous weeks a continuing escalation, right? So we've had um, the United States, at least, has previously it was taking out non-essential personnel, taking out the families of embassy personnel and stuff like that out of the diplomatic area when the embassy was still located in Kyiv. Then, like a week or so ago, they decided to move the embassy to Lvov, to farther west, to more strongly Ukrainian ethnic regions towards the western Ukrainian border. And then today and last night, there was some Twitter chatter about how the U.S. had moved the embassy tour into Poland, basically. So essentially, the U.S. Diplomatic services have essentially evacuated Ukraine, which is never a good sign when that happens, right? That would indicate that at least the United States thinks that a full invasion of Ukraine is imminent, not just a partial one. So that is a significant escalation, and pretty much that's where we stand right now.
Yes, indeed. Also, the Russian embassy in Kiev, I believe that's been evacuated as well. Um, Unconfirmed reports, though, that we saw smoke coming from the Russian embassy in Kiev the other day, and I'm not sure what the current situation is with that. Although Russians evacuating that embassy seems kind of makes sense, especially with the recent escalation with the eastern regions now being Russia's protectorate, as we shall see. Officially recognition. Russia officially recognized the separatist regions as independent, as the U.S. warns Putin is seeking a pretext for invasion. Vladimir Putin recognition of the Donbass following a near hour-long address to the Russian nation. Putin signed a declaration recognizing the separatist regions. I deemed it necessary to make a decision that we should have been made a long time ago to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of Donetsk People's Republics and Luhansk People's Republics, Putin said. Earlier Monday, during a President's Security Council meeting in the Kremlin, several top Russian officials argued that they supported recognition of the independence of the eastern regions. During Putin's long television speech, translated live by the Russian state media, Putin accused Ukraine of being a puppet regime, and those who have seized power and holding power in Kiev and demanded an immediate cessation of hostilities, Putin said, according to a translation. Otherwise, all responsibility for the possibility continuation of the bloodshed will entirely be on the conscience of the ruling regime of the territory of Ukraine. Putin also said Ukraine is not a neighboring country, but also an inherent part of our history with blood and family ties during a speech according to RT. The modern Ukraine was completely created by Russia, Putin said, going so far as to say it was created by Joseph Stalin in the 1920s during the Soviet Union. Although that is not correct. However, Mr. Putin's view of Ukraine fits in line with our last stream, where he sees Ukraine as a spiritual heritage and part of the Russian nation state. That is fitting quite well, as he's much more willing to donate resources and men to this cause, as he sees it as a long-term investment, especially with Western aggression towards Russia most recently.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely something where Putin is like almost as crazy as it sounds, like a moderate among his own nation, his own people, right? Because we've talked about a little bit about Dugin's attitude last week, where Dugin is basically saying, well, it doesn't really matter what the resource material considerations are. Like, this is actually, sovereign Russian soil. It belongs to us. We have the ability to metaphysically speak to, the stones and the trees and things like that in any sort of ethnically and historically Russian region. So, I mean, whereas Putin is much more of a pragmatist, but there is a very clear desire for this territory, I would say, from the Russians, and Putin, as a long-term project, as we've said, definitely wants this.
Yeah, he definitely does. He sees it as a long-term security to Russia's interests and also long-term security concerns, especially as we talked about the Von Golga gap earlier on our previous stream. That is very important, as allowing NATO to put troops on those eastern regions of Ukraine would mean they would be in striking region of Russia's heartland. And so that's something Putin doesn't want to happen, but he also wants to protect the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the east of Ukraine, which there have been allegations from both sides of genocide supposedly being committed on the other, and other acts of violence committed on Russian Ukrainian speakers, and Ukrainians going back and saying that no, it's the Russian-backed Ukrainians who have been shelling innocent civilians from their bases in the republics and attacking us. And so it's hard to know who to believe, as these reports mainly come from the republics, and so it's hard to verify who's doing what, what's actually happening. And most of the media is biased, of course, so we can't get an unbiased source on that. And so we don't really know what's exactly going on. However, take it with a grain of salt from both sides until we have official evidence of any mass atrocities being committed in the east of Ukraine, I would say.
Right, and you're also in counter to that. You've also seen some rhetoric from the usual GAE media, right, where you're hearing some screeching about, oh, if Putin takes Ukraine, think about the minorities, think about the LGBTQI plus people. You've definitely seen some increase in the rhetoric that would be into the population groups that would support the current regime in the United States. So that's also never a good sign, because they're solidifying support amongst the people who are most likely to support them, and basically the war camp. Basically, they're trying to create the war camp, and we're obviously in the anti-war camp in terms of the United States and Russia. So. Not a good sign. Definitely not a good sign.
No, definitely, especially with these warmongers trying to get us into another war that doesn't benefit our interests and only benefits them, and the military industrial complex, which pays them handsomely for military equipment paid for wars that do not benefit us. And so let's move on to something else I wanted to mention: the ethnic linguistic map of Ukraine. And this is very important to understanding how Russia views the situation and also how the Ukrainians view the situation. The ones who can logically understand things and not be caught up in propaganda sources, of course. So we see Donetsk and Luhansk are very predominantly Russian speaking, obviously, if not Russian majority speaking. Also, a large ethnic Russian minority in those regions as well. And to the 80 percentile in Luhansk, and I believe 60% in Donetsk, the last time I checked. However, the interesting to think about is, with Russia moving troops into the rebel-held territory in these oblasts, what is their aim, of course, long-term? Because that doesn't seem like something, just those two territories that Putin sees as worth this. So what his possible goals could be on a long-term basis would be to annex Novorossiya, the area in blue and light blue, up to Odessa and Transnistria, to the Moldavian border, to Belgorod in the Kharkov Oblast, down to the Black Sea and the Crimean province. So that could be a possible solution that Putin sees as viable if he chooses war. That is chosen as an option. However, the Ukrainians see this as very differently, of course. They see this as a violation of their sovereign territory and an act of aggression against them. However, the Ukrainian ego is inflated by Western backing, especially by military assets flowing in from Poland most recently, and the US and the UK. Flowing in, especially anti-tank missiles, javelins, anti-tank weapons, tanks, helmets, military equipment flowing in to Kiev to prop up the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian regime, which is, of course, came into being by the Maidan protest to overthrow the pro-Russian President Timoshenko in 2014, of course. So the Ukrainian regime is questioned as legitimate. However, the Ukrainian people do view this as a long struggle for independence from Russia since the First World War all the way up to the recent era in the 90s. So that's what Russia could view this as. What do you think, Mandrill?
Well, I mean, to go back to your point about stuff being poured into Ukraine, that's definitely true. I mean, we've also seen, as of last week, the UK, giving military aid, things like anti-tank, anti-air missile weapons, etc. Um, and then, as of last night, there was an announcement made that Poland had actually given some significant military resources, which I would expect that stuff to be, more like heavy equipment, because it was being shuttled in on a train. So that's probably going to be things like tanks, anti-aircraft weapons, self-propelled artillery, aircraft, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so we don't exactly know what was in those shipments, but that's the stuff that I would kind of expect if you're putting it on a train. Um, right, instead of having it be flown in. So that's probably going to be heavy equipment, which is basically all the stuff that Ukraine needs. So that's an interesting thing there as well.
Definitely, especially with the recent breakdown in negotiations by Putin and the Western counterparts in the US and the European Union. The negotiations have not been fruitful, of course. Lots of back and forth, lots of straw man arguments that we've heard that Putin is literally going to take over the entire Ukraine, that he's literally Hitler incarnate, as we've seen from many media sources, that he's going to set up camps if he invades Ukraine. And so that informs these people's worldview, of course, when they're negotiating with Vladimir Putin and the embassy and his other staff, trying to get a peace, which would be the preferred solution, of course. However, we are ruled by incompetent people who don't understand foreign policy like we do and history, and view things through the territorial lens of expansion of the GAE influence, and any threat to that is literally Hitler and their worldview, of course.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. We've made mention of that before. Anyone who's paying attention to this understands that the oh my god, literally Hitler narrative is something that these people are going to use, and that's why you're seeing a lot of the rhetoric towards the LGBTQI plus stuff, and why last week you were seeing videos being passed around of Ukrainian babushkas wielding AK-47s and joining a militia, basically. The other thing to mention, I think, real quick, that people may not have heard of is that the Germans have essentially declined to certify the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is very significant. I previously have said on Twitter that Germany is going to be the one to watch here. And I still kind of maintain that view. If Germany is going to be, I don't think they'll be pushing for war, the Germans. I think they'll be more likely to do things that are like up to and including, slapping Russia on the wrist. The real test is going to be to see if the GAE can push Germany, and indeed the rest of the EU and NATO into a hot war conflict over this stuff. That's going to be the true test, and the GA needs the German leadership, because the Germans are obviously the preeminent financial leaders in the EU to be able to do that. So I think I can't remember. Do you remember if France actually what's going on in France right now? Because I didn't see any updates as of this morning on what France was going to do.
I heard last time that Macron tried to get a meeting between Putin and Biden, but that a date wasn't formed. Nothing concrete came out of that meeting. That's the last I've heard out of Paris.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything out of Paris either, other than that as well. The French seem, at least until we get an update from them, much more inclined to diplomatic action. I'm not exactly sure what the mood is in France in terms of whether there's a hunger for war. I don't know whether Macron wants war. I think Macron does not want war, especially when he's up and coming towards an election year, where he's vulnerable to two far right parties, which may actually unify in opposition if that is the way that the French right feels about it. So we'll see. This is a very dynamic situation here, and I would say that yes, considering how big France and Germany are in the leadership of the EU and in NATO, look to see the U.S. begin courting support. And I would say that the fact that the Germans have, declined to certify Nord Stream 2 now, after it was previously certified and approved, and the Biden administration allowed it to be approved, that's a significant step here. So, I mean, from my perspective, at least on Nord Stream 2, I find the timing of this very interesting. If I were Putin, I would have waited until it was completed, considering it was already certified. Um, but that's just, he's probably just willing to take the cost at this point. But I would have waited until Nord Stream 2 was completed, so that Germany would have been very unwilling to just shut off the gas, basically, because the fact that it's not still completed is a way that Germany can getting around shutting off petroleum shipments to their own people, basically. So I mean, that's what I would say.
They're interesting about Germany is they haven't sent weapons, as far as I know, most recently to Ukraine. They've only sent helmets, obviously. And so it'll be interesting to see if the USA can get Germany to send maybe modern Leopard 2 tanks, maybe modern rifles made in Germany to the Ukraine. Sorry, Ukraine. I get that right. To Ukraine to support the Ukrainian army. We'll see if the US can more interestingly get Germany to supply them with weapons, as Germany, interestingly, hasn't really been supplying Ukraine with weapons, mostly because of this Nord Stream 2 situation and Germany's attitude towards war and their position with Russia, which is quite complex. And most recently, as we have seen by the new German leadership with the new German chancellor meeting with Putin quite regularly now. And yeah, that's a situation with Germany, I would put it. However, another situation I would say that we need to look out for is this crisis is how the media is trying to get it to be a distraction, possibly, for the Biden regime's possible failures and declining approval rating, especially before the midterm elections. That's something we need to look out for, possibly.
Right, right. And from the Biden administration's position here, they definitely need a new issue, right? I mean, we were talking about Wag the Dog and how they literally operate like Wag the Dog. I mean, this is like declaring war on Albania, basically. So
Or
they,
bombing Serbia.
yeah, now that the COVID narrative is starting to wane, and there's a problem, right? They need a new distraction, and Russia in Ukraine provides them with an ample distraction and also an ability to destroy ideological opponents in abroad in Russia, right? Obviously, Russia is the most based state at the moment in the tangentially, peripherally, yeah, connected to the West here. So the GA is obviously going to target whoever is appears the most based at any moment, whether they're actually based or not. It doesn't really matter. It's always who appears the most based. So that's kind of why the Western elites hate Russia so much. Back to the German thing here, real quick. I found that very interesting that they've provided helmets. Do you remember how many, or the quantity that they provided?
I believe it was only like 4,000 helmets, or it
Oh,
was
okay.
5,000. It wasn't a lot. It was mostly a
Okay.
symbolic gesture.
Yeah, yeah. It's about a third of a division, basically. So not even enough helmets to equip a division. Which, I mean, I suppose, and the Ukrainians don't have a choice but to accept what they can. The other thing, right, is obviously, since Germany is probably going to be loath to supply weaponry, I'm sure that as things continue to break down, the United States is going to pressure the other European nations to give what they can. And once you start to see things like medical supplies, radios, clothing, body armor, like we just said with the helmets and stuff, that's going to be a big deal as well.
Also, if they start providing blood supplies like plasma and other medical needs, I'm not sure if they've already done that. I haven't really kept up with that. From when we heard about weapons shipments from
Right.
Poland.
If I remember correctly, there was some intel. I can't remember if you mentioned it or if I was on the stream with Credentialist and Paul Fahrenheit, where this was mentioned, where at least on the Russian side, there was appeared to be indications that the Russians, I think, were stockpiling blood reserves, which is seems to indicate some sort of offensive, right? Because you're going to need that stuff for casualties. So at least on the Russian side, that has already happened, right? Whereas we haven't quite seen that from the Ukrainian side yet, but I think that that's probably going to happen shortly if it does happen.
Yeah, most likely soon if things escalate in the Donbass region and shots are fired or artillery lands in the wrong country, you could have a very bloody situation in which quite a lot of innocent people will die because of two foreign powers' interest in expanding their spheres of influence, although one having a more historical claim to the area, and the other just wanting to expand the GE's influence in Eastern Europe. So history will see who was right about that.
Right. I mean, this is why, I mean, to go to a more like based and like red pilled reactionary take, I mean, this is where it really comes down to the use of force, right? I mean, the old thing about uh, people being, the might is right perspective, where whoever wins in terms of a military conflict has, the mandate of heaven, basically. Um, that's kind of where we're getting to, right? The GAE, obviously, from our perspective, appears to have much more cynical and self-interested motivations, whereas as Russia is clearly trying to maintain a sphere of influence, which is very clearly in its own like doorstep and its own backyard. So, um, I mean, yeah, the I don't know how you feel about this, but I just feel that this is going to get really ugly very soon here. The escalation seems to be increasing very rapidly. I will note there was some move over this last week by the Russians, which appeared that they were moving some of their infantry forces away from the Ukrainian border. So they're like we kind of everybody seemed to breathe easy for about a day or two, and then things started escalating again, which is never a good sign because that meant that there seemed to be some honest move towards de-escalation, at least on the parts of the Russian troop movements, and then all of a sudden, the situation is just declining rapidly.
It is indeed, especially we have recent reports. I saw some last night that apparently Ukrainian shells have damaged like a building in the Rostov Oblast of Russia, and apparently other shells from the Ukrainian side supposedly have landed in the Rostov Oblast on the Russian border. And we've seen, I think I've heard reports of rockets landing as well on the eastern borders. And so we see this provocation. I'm not sure if we can call it a false flag. Most likely is. Not sure who's doing it. Of course, it's hard to tell. However, it only points to one thing. However, and that's escalation and a possible casus belli. Of course, now with the Russian troops officially being on the line of contact. So, if any Ukrainian offensive to try to foolishly retake the Donbass would immediately result in a war, probably for that whole Novorossiya region we saw in the blue earlier on this live stream.
Right. I mean, this is a very important point, and we were talking about this in the stream chat before we came on. Um, the false flags are going to be. I'm just going to advise everybody to be very cautious right now and to not buy into any sort of hype, um, simply because there are now so many interested parties here that we do not know, or we might not be able to, to distinguish who is perpetrating any sort of false flag or any sort of, um, intelligence operation or anything like that. We have to be very careful about such things because we don't want to fall into the hype and to increase tensions unnecessarily. So we need to be very cautious and um, uh, like almost very just to maintain an atmosphere of calm in the face of chaos, essentially. And I'm just going to say that, the just because there are, two obvious power blocks here does not mean that there isn't going to be a false flag by some other power. And in fact, there might be, if there is one, because there are other interests in the world other than just the GAE and other than just the Russian Federation, and other than the EU. So you might definitely see some other tangential or unrelated third power who's actually going to do something like that because they want the GAE and Russia to go to war.
Yeah, and we should take these stories about so-called shells landing in countries or buildings being blown up or bombs in the city of Donetsk targeting a separatist leader hierarchy. We should view that with a huge grain of salt, of course. Don't take one side or the other until we have actual facts that can be backed up.
Right. I mean, when I see Twitter chatter, like, I mean, my standard for this is if I'm seeing something that's being reported on, like, like for example, the Russian Federation, like their assembly basically approving Putin's request to be able to deploy troops abroad. Um, that's something which, from my standard of proof, that I just take off of chatter basically. Whereas for other things, like something that looks like, oh, hey, violence is being done, that's, chatter is good for just to get the temperature and stuff. But like I'm going to require video proof before any sort of like violent military action or bombings or artillery fire or anything like that. Like, I kind of need combat footage. I don't want to just hear about it.
Yeah, I'm the same with you. I don't take anyone's media sources. As we all know, the media is a source of propaganda for a reason, of course. Controlled consent, of course, manufactured consent, playing on people's emotions with emotionally charged rhetoric of Mr. Mustache Man from World War II. He's going to create camps, atrocities, mass genocide being committed. Oh, they're violating the treaty, shelling innocent civilians. So it's a complicated mess, very complicated in the eastern regions right now. So keep that in
Well,
mind.
yeah, I think we've got everybody up to date on the situation here. If you would like, we can move on to possible scenarios that might happen in terms of Putin's decision making here, because there's a very clear play that Putin can make, which is he has to make a decision on how far he's willing to go, right, and when he is willing to be able to do that stuff. So if you'd like to move on to that, I think we can. This is probably a good jumping off point.
Sure, I'll go ahead and share the map of Ukraine and we can discuss possible scenarios that Mr. Putin or the West could use in the Ukraine. So I will discuss this situation from Russia's point of view and what could possibly happen. So situation one, we already have troops, Russian troops, officially in the rebel territory in the east. So either Ukrainian provocation, a shell could hit populated area in Rostov, Belgorod, or I don't know, they could target a city on the border with Belarus, something along those lines, or try an offensive just with Western backing to retake the eastern regions, which would be a foolish move. And then the Russians would have their casus belli to just go ahead and annex the eastern regions all the way up to Dnieper and to Odessa and to Transnistria on the Moldavian Romanian border. Also, another thing we need to point out with this possible scenario is that the Crimea Dnieper Canal is blocked, which provides the source of water for the majority of Crimea. And so that has been blocked since 2014. And so if Russian troops were to take this area in blue, they could destroy that dam, thus providing water to the vast plains of the Crimea and to the farmers and people of Crimea, which are now under Russian protectorate. So that's the possible scenario.
Yeah, and that's, I think we can both agree that if Putin decides to actually press the button for warfare, that's the most likely scenario. I think is that he would do exactly as you just said. He would go up until the banks of the Dnieper and to the Transnistria area, basically taking all of the areas which are either majority or plurality Russian ethnically. So I mean, this is just looking at the map of Ukraine. That seems to be uh, his best scenario in terms of territory taking. Now, that's not without significant costs, and the GAE kind of doesn't want him to do that, right? Uh, for obvious reasons. So he might decide to play it safe and take what the defense is kind of giving him here. So he might just simply say, "Well, okay, we've already taken the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. We've basically accepted the legitimacy of the separatist governments here. So he might decide that, well, okay, so we've taken the legitimacy of the separatist governments. So we've already asked that the Russian, um, um, they're basically the Russian assembly to send in troops to these to foreign soil, basically. So there you go. Oh, look, that provides a ready pathway to be able to put troops into Donetsk and Luhansk, at least the separatist backed republics. Now, he might decide to go a bit further, right? He, of course, in this situation, he's probably thinking about maximizing territorial gain for minimal cost. So, from that perspective, he might just simply take the entire regions of Donetsk and Luhansk and basically, like, um, like make the GAE decide what it has to do, right? Because that's obviously not um, a good situation for the GAE because they'd have to decide, okay, are we really willing to go to war over the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk as opposed to just the separatist-backed, Republican regions? Um, so, from his perspective, that would be a way to get a very easy and quick victory over the GA to expand territory in a very small manner, to expand Russia's borders, whilst also avoiding conflict. And of course, this was going to be roundly condemned in everywhere that you could possibly think of, but he would still achieve a small victory at the price of nothing, essentially. So, that's the minimalist scenario. Now, the maximalist scenario here is obviously going to be a Russian conquest of the entire Ukraine, which, given the um, diplomatic evacuation of the embassy from the United States, or from Ukraine, of the American embassy from Ukraine, um, the that seems to indicate that the GAE at least is, if it is not overtly expecting, it is definitely preparing for a mass Russia invasion. Just because I mean, we don't exactly know yet. And I think that that's Russia's willingness to go to war over this is going to be determined by what other powers are going to get on side with the GAE. And I think that if he were to invade the entirety of the Ukraine, that would be a catalyst for other powers which previously were not so warm or not so hot on the prospect of war with Russia, or were kind of like, lukewarm, like, Germany is or France is, or still committed to a diplomatic solution. That would be something which would instigate a catalyst, which would be a catalyst for a general conflict, I think. So I don't think Putin would do the maximalist thing here. I think most likely he is probably going to do either of the first two scenarios, depending on what he perceives that he can get away with.
Yeah, most likely. In that scenario, which he goes for the greater Ukraine, from the war plans that I've heard, this right here would be the first part. Taking this area, as this would be much easier and cost much less, as these people are much more pro-Russian and have heritage, and which be much more likely to not resist Russian troop movements. However, if Ukraine is still not willing to negotiate with these new borders, the second move would be to take this region right here and have troops move in from Belarus to attack Kiev and to force Zelensky to negotiate pro-Russian settlement in the Ukraine situation, and that could be most likely to happen. However, from what I've heard, the third plan, if that fails, is just to take over this area at the west, bordering Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Moldavia, Romania, and that would most likely be very contentious and very costly. And Putin probably knows this, and that could lead to NATO troops intervening, missile strikes, airplane attacks on Russian positions in the Ukraine. So that's much more risky, and I don't think Putin would go for that option. In either scenario for war in Ukraine, Ukraine would lose, obviously. Russia is just much more bigger, has much more manpower, has much better aircraft, helicopters, missile systems, artillery. They have vast artillery, which is superior to the Ukrainian army. And so either way, the situation would not be favorable to Ukraine because they would lose a lot of territory. They would lose territory in either scenario, the way I see it.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. However, the wild card scenario that we should also bear in mind, right, is given the military superiority of Russia, even though Ukraine is receiving, pretty substantial help, and that military assistance is probably going to only increase given an increase in Russian aggression. I mean, it really is then becomes a question of whether or not the Ukrainian military forces will collapse quickly or slowly. If they are able to be a significant speed bump, given all the help that they've received and the forces they can already muster, that would also help to determine, at least from Putin's decision-making mindset, which territories he's willing to go after, right? However, the true wild card scenario here is whether or not you have the collapse entirely and rapidly of the Ukrainian military. If Putin is able to, just given the geographical areas here, if he's able to, cut them off in any significant way, like for example, if you look at any sort of all these little geographic areas of Ukraine, right, where he could basically do an operationally, what is basically an operational enfilade, right? So he just surrounds them, cuts them off, and forces the Ukrainian military to surrender. You could perhaps see some sort of collapse scenario in which basically the Ukrainian military is unable to resist. Putin realizes that he's unable to resist, and so he'll just basically march across Ukraine as far as he can before the United States does anything or is able to do anything. So that's the main issue, right? And logistically, I mean, assuming that Putin is going to be able to conquer any of the areas of Ukraine that are able to receive aid from the sea, that is going to be significant as well for that strategy, right? Because once you do that, you can cut off any sort of aid from the Black Sea. And that's pretty much the scenario that might also happen in terms of a wild card.
Yeah, another thing we need to think about in a possible war scenario is how much would partisans actually play a factor, of course. And the Western media has been hyping up how Ukrainians are going to defend their lands to the last, and even though if the army retreats, the partisans will attack the Russians and force them to leave the country. And this is obviously overblown. As we've seen in many wars, partisans don't often play a huge role, often just like a hindrance to logistical supplies, mainly. Hit and run tactics, mainly.
Right. But you must remember, right? So bearing that in mind, I mean, let's put it this way. Look at the Dnieper here, right? The Dnieper is a barrier for the Ukrainians to fall back to, but it's also a massive obstacle, right? Let's assume that the majority of the Ukrainian armed forces are located in the West, as you naturally would in any sort of armed conflict, right? If Russian-backed separatists were able to target, infrastructure and bridges and railway lines, et cetera, that have to go over the Dnieper. That would mean that any sort of Ukrainian withdrawal from the west and a reformation to the east of the Dnieper would be incredibly difficult, right? Which is kind of what I'm also talking about in terms of the scenario, the wild card scenario I just mentioned. So if the Ukrainians are unable to, for whatever logistical reason, to withdraw, or they might be able to withdraw but without significant amounts of equipment to the east, then I mean that's going to be incredibly devastating for them, and would play kind of into the wildcard scenario that I just lined out.
Yeah, this scenario could go many ways. It all really depends on if what Russia's goals are here and how far he's willing to go. And also, another thing we need to think about, not just with how much territory he wants to annex and where to go, the line is would he try to make the rest of Ukraine a pro-Russian state? In the scenario where he just goes for Novorossiya and takes the entire Black Sea coast. That is a possibility. However, that would be much more harder, as the GAE has a lot of influence, especially in this western region, as it is close to EU countries, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, and lots of Western assets could flow in, propping up a pro-Western Ukrainian regime in Kiev. So that is a possibility. However, with this territorial loss, it is also possible that the pro-Western Ukrainians in the orange here would probably want maybe to install a pro-Russian president in Ukraine to get peace finally. That's possible as well. A scenario we need to think about.
Yeah, but that scenario would largely be disastrous for the GAE, right? If you have a pro-Russian president, um, which would essentially be at least tacitly supported by the Western Ukrainian regions. I mean, obviously, we've seen the electoral breakdown of Ukraine. They're basically all on the lines we see up on the screen right now. But if that were the case, that would be basically the Ukraine accepting that it's now in Russia's sphere of influence, and that would be disastrous to the GE, and they don't want that. So I sincerely doubt that would happen. Yeah, mostly to my back to my wild card scenario. Sorry to keep us on
No,
that
it's fine.
subject, but right. So like the Western backed regions, right? The GE kind of assumes that those regions are going to be willing to fight. I don't know about that. If the Ukrainian military in the West, where the Russian regions are, suffers a catastrophic enough defeat early on, they might not. There might still be some residual resistance, but of course, like I mentioned before, if Russia can destroy or cut off any sort of thing in terms of military equipment, the most decisive military equipment, I mean, Ukraine might just be unable to resist, right? So that would be an easy march for the Russians into the Western regions. I think also to my wildcard scenario, this upper portion in the top center, right, just above the Dnieper, where it's a little pinkish, right, where there's a little bit of a Russian ethnic contingent there.
Around the Kursk Oblast, yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, right to just to the east of Kyiv. I think that's one of the regions that we could also conceivably see if Russia does do a sort of wild card scenario or is aggressively expansionary. I think just because it's also again to the east of the Dnieper, so it's going to be relatively easy for the Russians to go after that area as well. So that's going to be, if things do go hot, that's going to be a region to watch, in my view, just looking at the geographical layout here.
Yeah, most of Ukraine is just like flat farmland with little obstacles besides the Dnieper and the Carpathian Mountains in the west. However, it's very doubtful if the Russian military would advance that far in the west, especially with the possible interference of the GAE and the European Union countries, possibly intervening on the Ukrainian side to push the Russians back and to essentially break up East and West Ukraine, possible East Germany, West Germany. That's a possible scenario here, most likely.
Yeah, that's a possibility. Again, the GAE is very loath to do something like that. I think that wouldn't be a de jure thing. That would be like a de facto split where Putin basically just can't be resisted to the east of the Dnieper and in um, Transnistria. So he would just basically take all those regions, and the GA can't do anything about it. Basically, the other thing, right, is and why I say that that region to the east of Kyiv is to be looked at is the GA's viewpoint on this is going to be very clear, right? Because this gives them an excuse because okay, this is an ethnically Ukrainian majority area. Um, so if Russia decides to put troops in this area, well, then that gives the GA an excuse to put in even more arms, more ammunition, more equipment, more supplies and money, and just keep pouring it into the Ukraine to make a speed bump. Um, um, where the more that Putin decides to, this is a really weird situation too, right? The more Putin decides to take, the more Western resistance there will be. So I mean, he has definitely got an incentive here to take as little as possible, but also to just take what the defense is able to give him, and he's really got to be willing to accept risk here if he wants to get anything done.
Yeah. However, the further west he advances, not only does Western score an increase, possibly partisans who would be willing to fight the Russian military. That also
Yeah.
increases the further west you go. So that is a factor too, as well as how the people view Russians.
Right, right. I mean, also that's the other thing too is does he really want at this time to deal with an ethnic insurgency in Ukraine? I'm not sure that he does. On a long enough time scale, right? If he's got, if Russia has 20 or 30 years to do that, I mean, yes, they. I mean, that's something they'd be willing to do to gain this region. I think. Um, but not at the current moment. I don't see Putin other than the wild card scenario that we've talked about. I don't see him really willing to take the entirety of Ukraine. I think that this is going to be a much more limited conflict. The question is, where is the borders? Where are the borders of the conflict going to be? Or is this simply going to be in the Donetsk, Luhansk region, or is this going to be in the ethnic majority regions of Ukraine, basically? So definitely, I think that there's going to be some sort of conflict given the escalation. However, we are awaiting the scope and the scale here.
Yeah, and also GE involvement if it were to come to that scenario. Another thing we could also see in these light orange oblasts here, I'm not sure if that's what they're called in Ukrainian, we could see pro-Russian speakers being expelled essentially to the east, and pro-Western Ukrainians here being expelled to the west. A population transfer would most likely occur after this. The lines of this new country are drawn, most likely, is what we will see, and that would create a very bad recipe for potential retribution from both sides, who are heavily propagandized against each other currently.
Yeah, right. I mean, it would. I will say this, right, from the perspective of the Ukrainians, this would be a sort of like event which might precipitate a sort of ethnogenesis, right? Because, Ukrainians have a lot of historical ties to Russia. They've always been inside the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. Um, the languages are very similar. The culture's, similar. You know, the only real thing when in terms of like being able to distinct make yourself distinct ethnically is foreign aggression. Basically, that is one scenario of how ethnic groups usually come to view themselves as unique and distinct. And if this event occurs and Ukrainians take it the way that I've just described, then absolutely they will view themselves as separate and distinct from any sort of Russian population, which I mean they kind of already do, but that would be a solidification of the divisions that we see.
Yeah, they would become permanent essentially. Unlike the opposite situation in Belarus, which is becoming more pro-Russian and Russified. As we speak, the opposite will occur in Ukraine by this conflict, potential conflict, if it comes to that. However, they will also see it as a rallying cry as well. If another war were to continue with the whole West against Russia to retake these eastern lands, of course, that's also a scenario we need to think about. However, with that being said, is there anything else you want to cover before we hop out today?
No, I think we've been pretty comprehensive in a very short deal of time. So, everybody, that's the update for the situation. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys like what you hear, I do have a YouTube channel. You can follow me on Twitter and Gab. I'm much more active on Twitter. I'm also usually hanging out in the Prudentialists Telegram chat. That's where I do the majority of my shit posting. Yeah, give me a follow. Make sure that you like and share this stream for American Populist. And yeah, come hang out and come watch my streams. I usually do a couple streams with the Prudentialist as well. So, and I've got a couple different other ones that have been discussed in future. So, yeah, definitely, I'm going to be doing some more activity online.
Indeed, check him out. I also will be covering more complex topics such as foreign policy, philosophy, and history on my channel, as I am currently. And so basically, to put the situation in summary, it's not going to end well for either side, as it will be costly to many civilians who are caught in the crossfire between these two great powers. However, neither side's going to come to a compromise on this. This is a red line, as Putin has said in the West. Not really, as much as it's kind of a faded red line. And so that's currently where we stand on the Ukraine situation, and I'll keep you updated if war or something were to escalate. However, if you do enjoy the stream, please like and subscribe, as I do greatly appreciate it. And have an excellent day.